It's alive. Happy Halloween. And I'm seeing we're joining from all over. Um, I'm based in Washington, D.C. today, where I work at the Pulitzer Center. And I'll tell you a little bit more about us in a bit. Some of you might be able to help me tell the rest of us about us, since you joined me last week to talk about how to find and analyze underreported stories. But we're also joined today by a special guest from the Pulitzer Center. Marina, do you mind unmuting yourself and letting us know where you're based today?
Good morning, everyone. I am based in Maryland today, but originally I am from Argentina.
Thank you so much for joining us, Marina. And later today, we'll also be joined or we'll be guided by Xavier, who's going to take us through our Q&A. Xavier, you want to quickly unmute and just say hey to everybody? Tell us where you're based today.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Xavier Dominguez, and I am based in Las Cruces, New Mexico, so more down south.
Awesome. Well, thank you all for jumping into the chat, and please continue to use the chat to connect with each other. So actually, I'm going to stop sharing for one moment because I realize I need to share my audio. There's that button. All right, here we go. So basically, we are going to run for students in the room today this session as if you were in a Zoom meeting, for those of you who've done that before, which means I think you should have the ability to mute and unmute yourself. And so we just ask to please keep yourself muted while there's a presentation happening, so we don't have that audio pickup, interruption thing. And then to please feel free to unmute when you would like to ask a question or make a comment. Throughout, to make sure our voices are being heard, we'll have the chat open. Just make sure, as you can see here on the right, that you change the setting above your chat where you're typing to make sure that your comment is going not just to the panelists, but also to all attendees, which is the way that you'll see each other's work. All right. And this is what we have planned for today. So the intro is going to be a little shorter than last week for those of you who are here, because we have a special guest, Marina Walker Guevara, who is the executive editor at the Pulitzer Center, but joining us after many experiences that I can't wait for you to hear about. And then we are going to move into a guided discussion and Q&A to get your questions answered. And then we'll end with a closing challenge and a brief survey. And all of this is going to be exploring this idea that we started talking about last week, for those of you who are here, on how can we start to identify underreported stories and find them for ourselves, whether in our own communities or in the world, and sort of getting that experience by hearing about the career of a really incredible journalist and editor. Our number one goal for today, just like last week, is to take care of yourselves and each other. Part of doing that is being respectful in the space, and also noting that a lot of us are spending time with more time with screens than maybe we have in the past. So please share your video if you feel comfortable. That way we can connect with each other. We understand, though, that if you don't feel comfortable doing that, don't do that. And also stand up, hydrate, do what you need to do to take care of yourself today. And another thing that, well, and that's that. So please take care of yourselves today. And, we all will benefit from your questions and comments. So we kind of learn best together with all of your voices, and encourage you to share those. Briefly, let me tell you why we're hosting this session today, or we were invited to host this session today. This place that Marina and I work is called the Pulitzer Center. And at the Pulitzer Center, our mission is to raise awareness about underreported global issues by directly supporting journalism. So we're a place that gives grants for journalism, news stories, and then also education and outreach programs like what we're doing today. And let's talk a little bit about why we do that work. So the first thing I want you to do, if you have your video on, show me on your hands, where is it that right now you're getting most of your news stories? Maybe you've seen some of the news stories we've worked on. So let me know on your hands, are you getting most of your news from a print newspaper, from the radio, from television, from a website, or from an app? And if you don't have your video on, you can just drop the number in the chat for which one of these you check the most. All right, on the screen here, I'm seeing a pretty heavy representation of 4s and 5s. So websites and apps. TV is a little bit more present in the chat right now. And I'd also ask you to now go to the chat and write in, what are some of the stories you're hearing right now in the news, where you're checking? What kinds of topics are you seeing? What kinds of issues are you seeing? And let's save 30 seconds for that. While we're looking at the chat, is there maybe one or two people who want to unmute and tell us what's a story that they've been hearing a lot in the news lately? You can just give me a wave or go ahead and unmute yourself. All right, no worries. Look, I do see a lot of discussion in the chat. COVID-19, politics, the Supreme Court. The story about more ballots being cast in Texas than the entirety of the 2016 elections. The Armenian-Azerbaijan conflict, racial justice, elections. So just notice which words we're seeing a lot and which words we're not seeing as much, because that kind of gets to the mission of the Pulitzer Center and what we're trying to do in our work with the news. So actually what we were seeing about where we're getting our information is pretty in line with what research studies are showing. This is a screenshot of a Pew Research Center study from 2018. And if you track from left, this is the youngest people that they surveyed, to right, the older people that they surveyed. You see a shift from, on the left, this big purple block, which when I look at the key says social media. It looks like that's where more 18 to 29-year-olds are getting their information. Just track that color as you go to the right and notice what other colors are rising. And this is kind of important for our discussion about finding underreported stories, because journalists, news outlets are aware of this. So we're seeing increased news in access through the internet, through apps, through social media, because we're seeing younger audience. That's where they're getting their information. And what that means is those topics that we were seeing repeated quite a bit, we might look at some of those as the breaking news stories, those topics that we're hearing about across all those outlets, and especially on social media. We're hearing about them from a lot of different people, right? And a lot of updates quickly. So that's important, right? Because everything that I'm seeing in the chat right now is an important news story, relates to you, relates to others in the world. And as we're getting more and more information online, it means that we're getting that important information updates really fast. While that's important to do that, one thing that we found as a challenge at the Pulitzer Center was, as more and more of these breaking news stories, these few themes that were identified as super important that needed updates, especially quickly on the internet, is that some stories were going underreported. And at the Pulitzer Center, what we focus on are the underreported stories. So just based on the words you see here, for any of you who were here last week, could you help share with us, what do you think makes something an underreported story? Maybe someone could unmute and share what they think makes a story underreported, maybe an example. I can also look to the chat. So maybe Angus mentions it might not impact you directly. Maybe that's why it's underreported. Another idea?
It's a story that hasn't quite been picked up by like bigger news outlets, or something that maybe the news doesn't believe is as important.
Maybe some people don't think it's as important and it hasn't been picked up. Thank you. Maybe one other reason, or one other way to identify these kinds of stories. Oh, I'm so sorry about that, Evan. Let's check on that. What's going on with your mic? I'm seeing it. Oh, it could be a perspective that goes against what is convenient for an authority, or maybe it's something that few people know about. You're all right. There are a lot of reasons that stories are going underreported. And what we're going to look at real quick is just I think I'm actually going to skip this for today to go ahead and give some more time to our speaker and just leave it in the presentation for you so you can check it later, because you kind of nailed everything that's in this video. What we're going to look at, though, is one thing Pulitzer Center is doing to help, because we've identified an issue with why stories are underreported. And it's that some journalists and news outlets don't have the funding to cover these stories. Honestly, because of a lot of the reasons you mentioned. Maybe it takes a lot of time to get the data to prove the story. It might, especially in the case where maybe it's something people don't want to get out there. It could be in a place that's hard to get to. It could be with a community covering something affecting a community that doesn't feel a lot of trust towards the media and doesn't feel open to sharing right away. We want to make sure that time and money are not factors that are limiting these stories from getting out there. And we want you to know that Pulitzer Center gives grants to journalists because if one day you want to be a journalist who covers underreported stories in your community, anywhere in the world, we want you to know we're a place that you can get what? Funding, money, right? So remember us and please reach out to us as you in the future if you move forward in pursuing journalism. We're also a place that you might find a lot of stories that could interest you and that you're just not seeing. And our guest is going to talk to us a little bit about that today. These are some of the places where our journalists have published, but we worked with, I think it was over 100, I think over 150 news outlets last year on over 180 projects. So you might have seen some of the stories we supported, but I know I'm not often checking that many outlets. So the Pulitzer Center might be a place for you to find some new outlets to check out. Also, these are all the kinds of topics that our grantees are covering with funding and publishing in those outlets. So if you see a topic here that interests you, as we start our presentation, I'm going to drop our website and our social media into the chat, and that could be a place that you could also explore later. Before I turn the floor over to our guest, who knows this reporting very well, I thought it might be interesting to share with her what are some of the issues right now that are particularly interesting to you, especially where you might want to find some of the underreported stories connected to those issues. So hold up with your hands, or you could drop in the chat the number of which of the global issues listed here you are most interested in. And if you don't see an issue here that you're interested in, please write in the chat, what is that? I'm seeing in the chat right now, Marina, this is good for us to know. So we're interested in authoritarianism, growing isolation and populism, the environment, 1, 2, and 3. All right, so the first 3 on the list here as well are pretty important to the group here. All right, and so many of us are interested in all of them, which I'm not surprised by given who we have with us today. So with that in mind, please notice as we turn the floor over to our speaker, any questions you have about not only some of these topics, especially because Marina is going to cover some of them, but also questions about how a journalist might cover these topics when we get to our Q&A. That will be an opportunity to get all those questions answered, as many as we can. All right, so without further ado, please join me in unmuting yourselves or joining me in the chat to welcome with a round of applause and welcome to Marina Walker Guevara, our guest today. Thank you, everybody, and thank you, Marina.
Thank you so much, Farid, and thank you everyone for sharing your Halloween day with us. If you hear some screams, those are my kids who are very excited, and it's Saturday, so they are in the house, very much around me, as well as my dog. I am going to go ahead and share my screen, and I am going to tell you a little bit why I became a journalist, what journalism means to me, and some of the stories I chose to do and why. I will ask you a couple of questions as we go, and please feel free to interact and to let me know how you're feeling, what you think in the chat, okay? So I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. Always that moment when you wonder if it's gonna work. Yeah, did it work? Excellent. Very good. So here we go. So let me just tell you first where I was born. I come from a city called Mendoza, which is located in Western Argentina, as you see right on the border with Chile. And as you see also by looking at this map, Mendoza is a desert pretty much, but it's a desert that was transformed into an oasis thanks to an ingenious irrigation system that was developed by the first inhabitants of these lands, the people that design this really cool series of canals that run virtually through every city in the province. They are called acequias, and they say that you are not from Mendoza if you haven't fallen into an acequia at least once in your life. And I have definitely fallen into one of them in my bike. So Mendoza, like many cities in the US and many cities in Latin America, is a city of contrasts, and it's a city of inequality. I wanted to show you a picture of two places my house was located right in the middle of these two realities. 20 blocks away from the house on the left that we used to call the castle, and 20 blocks away from the very poor neighborhoods on the right. So this tension that you see in this slide created a lot of questions in me from a very young age. And in part, I think I became a journalist to be able to ask questions and to find answers to those questions. And the questions to me were, who gets to have power? What voices are being silenced? And for me, that question was very relevant because part of my childhood, I grew up in a dictatorship. Some of you were talking about how authoritarianism is a topic that matters to you. I experienced it from a very young age. Why do some communities and groups never seem to be able to get ahead? So in journalism's mission, I found a great platform to be able to question and to find answers. There are many things that journalism do. I am going to focus on the three that speak more directly to me and to why I became a journalist, to bear witness and get as close as possible to the truth. And of course, to be able to get as close as possible to the truth, we need to do it with a journalism that is rigorous, that is fair, and that is accountable. And also wonder, how can we get as close as possible to the truth if our newsrooms are not diverse, if our newsrooms do not reflect the communities that we are trying to serve? Oh, somebody raised their hand. Is that true? I love that. Paco? It says Paco Henry raised hand. So do we have a question or should I continue?
I think you can go ahead. Paco was saying, sorry, my bad, but yes, please raise questions if you have questions, everybody. Okay. Also start adding them to the chat.
Excellent. Also journalism's mission to hold the powerful accountable. And when we say that, we mean all forms of power. So governmental power, political power, corporate power, religious power, the power of NGOs and the civil sector, the power of the media where we work. And we become, and we want to be radically independent from all those forms of powers. Our job is to make the powerful uncomfortable. And finally, to spotlight the stories and the voices of communities that are systematically neglected. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So what are underreported stories, building on what we heard from Farid? So these are stories that point at the systemic causes of the crisis we face and that are often overlooked by the media. And why are they overlooked by the media? They take time and effort to report. They might be costly if they require travel or they require extensive data analysis, software, going to communities around the world. And again, they might be uncomfortable. They might be uncomfortable for those who fund our journalism. They might be uncomfortable for some of our readers. They might even be uncomfortable for our editors in our newsrooms. There are few stories in recent times that have been as uncomfortable to some sectors of societies as the 1619 Project of the New York Times. And can I see a raise of hands? Are you aware of this project? Can I see hands? Have you read it? Good. So as you know, this project reframes how we view the significance of slavery in American history and spotlights the central role that slavery played in the development of our country, of our institutions, of our economy, and even of our culture. it even challenged us to consider 1619, the year when the first slaves were brought to this country, as the possible foundation date for the country, the birth, the date of origin. In a recent call I was fortunate to take part of with Nicole Hannah-Jones, the lead reporter of this project, we were talking about the resistance and the pushback that this project has experienced, and also a little bit the Pulitzer Center, because we are the education partners of the New York Times 1619 project. And she talked about moments in history when societal systems have been challenged. And she said something, and I wrote it down and I put it on a sticker note on my desk: the moment when settled narratives are unsettled. And that's why she is not worked up and doesn't consider abnormal the resistance to the project. And she considers it even an incentive to keep going and to keep extending this new narrative. So we're going to talk a little bit now about three questions we can ask ourselves, three approaches to finding underreported stories. So the first one, I would say, starts with curiosity. Looking around in our communities, looking around about what's going on at the news, and asking ourselves, what is not right? What is unfair? I want to bring up a story I reported on when I was finishing my master's degree at the University of Missouri. And I decided I did not want to do a master thesis, which was pretty, cheeky thing to tell my professors. I do not want to do a thesis. I happen to want to do a journalistic story, of course, an in-depth story. So my challenge was to find that story that would make up, would be as significant as maybe a thesis would have been. I started looking like crazy everywhere, and I came across a very small story in a newspaper. It was a brief story, it was 2 paragraphs, but that story said that 99% of children in a small Peruvian town called La Oroya were poisoned with lead. And that there was a company, a Missouri-based company, so that was my local connection, always important. If I was living in Missouri, I was going to be publishing hopefully there, I needed to find a story that had that kind of local connection. That company had done a lot of damage locally in terms of pollution, and then when things became too hard, just decided to transfer its operations to Latin America, transfer the pollution. Again, talking about tensions, look at the tension here. This is to the left, the owner of the company, Doran, his house, which is considered the largest private home in the United States, in Massachusetts. And then to the right, La Oroya, this town where the company acquired an existing smelter and started to operate and promised people that it would fix the environmental problems. 5 years into the operations, 99% of kids are poisoned with lead. So I decided to pursue that story. I collaborated both with journalists who had covered the story in Missouri, and also with local journalists in Peru. It was a very first important lesson for me of not parachuting into a story, a verb that always stayed with me. We don't want to go and just land somewhere. We want to collaborate and know who is already covering this story, what opportunities there are for collaboration. We follow the money, we follow the pollution trails, and we were able to prove that not only the company was not fixing the problem and was not investing in the environmental plan as it had committed to do, but also that the money was being rerouted to shareholders in the US as opposed to being invested locally, and also that the quality of the air since the moment the company had acquired the smelter had decreased, had worsened, not only improved, but worsened. And we were able to see that in the documents that we obtained from the Peruvian government, from the inspections that were done in this plant. This story had no place in media until we did it. It was literally one of those rare moments where we were able to be like the first ones to tell this story with my colleagues in Peru and in the US. After that, so many stories were written about this town. The town was declared one of the 10 most polluted towns in the world, and the company is now on the way out. It finally was challenged legally, and it had to give up the plant, which is now going to be taken over by creditors, including by the workers. One thing I would say before we move on to the next portion of the presentation is that for this story, it helped me a lot to be aware of my own narratives in my head, that sometimes we can be simplistic and we can be polarized in our own heads, and go into a story thinking in terms of villains and victims and white and black and like, you know, just like these extremes. When I spend time with this community, what I realize is that their relationship with this smelter and with the mining reality was very complex. Their livelihoods depended on this smelter. Their identity was tied to this way of living, to the mining sector. But at the same time, so many sacrifices and so many difficulties were part of their experience as well. So how to reflect that complexity in a way that is fair, as opposed to go to the community with some predetermined narrative in our head. Okay, second possible approach to finding underreported stories. What is legal but immoral? In the previous example, in the example from Peru, it's a clear example of when things are just plainly wrong and illegal. And there were like several opportunities. We were able to document how the company had broken rules and regulations and expectations. But how many stories we encounter that are not obviously illegal, that are actually legal, that we as a society have decided that that is a system we're going to tolerate, the way we tolerated slavery in the United States, but it's profoundly moral. Those are super important stories for us to be focusing on. So I'm going to show an image, and I would love for you to, I'm going to try to access I don't think I can access the chat that easily while I am presenting. So let me see. Nope. Unfortunately, I can't see the chat, but I would like for you, like if anybody wants to unmute, I would love that, and tell me what you see in this image. What does this image represent? Just take a second to observe. Anybody would like to share what this image represents?
Hi.
Yes, please.
Okay. So I see a guy standing in front of an Italian flag, and in front of him is like a boat, a very fancy boat with very elegant looking people, and they're all laughing and pointing at him. And the caption at the top says, "Spot the fool who actually pays his taxes." So I feel like the people on the boat are rich people who don't pay taxes, and yeah, and I feel like that has a connection to the Panama Papers.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. That was great. And this is exactly that. This image, you know, separates. It shows the people in the yacht. They live in a separate world, a world with rules that apply only to them. And these are these tax havens, as you mentioned from the Panama Papers. They are designed to give advantage to powerful people over everybody else. And surprise, we as a society have decided that that is okay, that we are going to consider that legal. A phrase was coined even for this, and the phrase was that tax havens or tax avoidance is perfectly legal. So in fact, these tax havens have become a pillar of our economy. going back to the 1619 example, just like slavery was a pillar of the early economic development of this country. And it is one of the root causes of inequality, of the growing inequality that we experience in the US and around the world. So a group of journalists, and let me see if I can, a group of journalists started to question that of my colleagues in my former job at ICIJ. How can we unsettle this narrative? And the first thing that we realized is that we needed to get really smart and really savvy to be able to challenge structures like this, to be able to understand how this work works and this world works. And this world is completely complicated and complex on purpose and by design. So nobody can understand it. Even like the IRS has very hard time sometimes penetrating these structures. So the first thing is gaining that knowledge. The second thing was, if we were going to work the way that journalists had always worked, in isolation and as lone wolves, this was going to be the picture. We were going to be eaten alive by these super powerful companies and people that enjoy the privileges of the system. So we said we needed to change. We needed to work in a completely different way, in a radical new way, which we called it radical sharing or network reporting. And that meant making an agreement among ourselves as a sector that we were going to overcome our tendency to want to scoop one another, and instead we're going to join forces, share resources, share data, share documents, and really being able to tackle these stories. And of course, the main thing is to be able to trust someone is to leave our egos, which journalists are very attached to them, at the door. In doing that, we were able to meet the challenge. We were able to match not the power of those that we were investigating. We were also not interested in that, but we were able to match the complexity of the task that we had at hand. And we were able to break some of the most consequential stories of our times. Stories like the Panama Papers, the Paradise Papers, that challenge a settled narrative, that show what was wrong in very specific detail with tax havens, and also who benefited from them, which was pretty much everyone from the Queen of England to Bono, and everyone in between of them. But also it was able to show why this story was relevant to people, to regular people. Remember when someone said in the chat at the beginning that sometimes a story can be underreported because people don't realize how this story touched them. And I believe that in this case, this was the case. This was a story that until a few years ago, people just perceived that, this was something that rich people do and it really doesn't have any relationship to me. And with some of these projects, you hear my dog in the background. I'm sorry about that. She really wants to get into my room. But it was really powerful to see people going to the streets, demanding change, demanding their prime minister here to the left, the prime minister of Iceland, to step down. And also how money was recovered thanks to this reporting. So rich people were forced to pay their taxes, and regular people realized that they had a role to play in bringing about change and in unsettling those narratives. So I'm happy to talk a little bit more about that in the Q&A. The third question, just to finish on, before I go to the third question, just a few days ago, speaking about change, the British Virgin Islands, which is one of the most notorious tax havens, announced that they will be opening a register of beneficial owners, where the real owners of these tax haven companies will be able to be searched publicly, which is a huge step forward in making these systems more transparent. So the third one is like, what voices are missing? So when we are looking for underreported stories, ask ourselves, whose voice is not being heard? And this is something that our reporters are doing all the time at the Pulitzer Center. We just published a story, which I recommend that you follow, the cultural genocide that is going on in Xinjiang, in China, where like Muslim minorities are being basically not only persecuted, but their entire culture and religion is being erased as we speak. And so tracking them, some of them have been able to escape a network of camps that has been designed to brainwash them and to imprison them until they accept the status quo. But some of them have been able to escape those camps and to go to other countries. And intrepid reporters from BuzzFeed News and other places have tracked them and have brought their testimonies to us, what they saw, what they experienced, what is going on, because we're not going to learn that through the Chinese government narrative. The stories of those communities that are most affected by COVID-19 and how not very often we get to hear how they are experiencing it. For example, Native Americans, but also African Americans, and so on. A really nice story we published recently from Myanmar about the experience of miners in the jade mining community, and how, again, their complex relationship with something that is their livelihood, but also a very incredibly dangerous and lethal line of work for many of them. Our reporters did this story in the form of a graphic novel, different platforms and different ways to tell powerful stories. So summarizing and 3 things to remember, then to find underreported stories, we use our curiosity, what doesn't seem right. We challenge settled narratives, what is legal but immoral, and we center marginalized voices, who is not being heard. I wanted to ask someone, I'm seeing Angelica here, Angelica, maybe she wants to finish by reading this quote from my colleague Khadija Sharif in South Africa.
Yeah, I can go ahead and read it. Thank you. Our stories may not individually change the world, although some do, but putting what happened on the record to be reckoned with, built on, and maybe used later to spark change, that's more than a job. It's holding up a mirror to the society we live in and contrasting with it, with the kind of society in which we want to live.
Thank you so much, Angelica. And thank you everyone for your time, and happy now to answer your questions. I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you right now. So if you have questions that are specifically related to underreported stories, go ahead and put them in the chat. But I want to introduce Xavier, who will be leading about 10 minutes of questions. It is my pleasure to introduce him. He is a recent graduate of class of 2020 from Las Cruces High School. He was also, congratulations, he was also a PBS NewsHour Student Reporting Fellow. He was actually one of the Fellows of the Year. So we are ecstatic to have him here with us today. I'm going to turn it over to him, who will ask some questions for Marina. And then in the meantime, as you all have questions, high school students, please type them into the chat.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Takar, for having me, and especially Marina for your excellent presentation. So my first question is, I recently watched an interview with the Global Investigative Journalism Networks, and you talked a lot about the importance of making underreported stories an issue for all reporters in all countries. Would you, what should young journalists or even journalists in general know when tackling stories that require global attention?
I think one of the things I would recommend is to be able to overcome that polarity of the local and the global. We need to be able to see the global and the local connected, and that's something that we work really hard to do at the Pulitzer Center. Local and global are essential. It is the local story is if you just think about the Oroya story, it's a fundamentally a local story, but it talks about a bigger global theme of greed, of corporate malfeasance, malfeasance, of environmental damage and pollution, of illegal money flows or legal money flows. So when looking at these connections, try to build bridges as you frame your reporting, as you pursue these stories. And I think it's going to be easier to sell them to editors. It's going to be easier to find outlets to tell these stories. And it's going to be easier to find partners to tell those stories with.
And then, so it looks like we have a question in the chat from Angus. And then he says, on the topic of political climate of Argentina, do you think the Peronist leader of Argentina, Alberto Fernandez, is leading Argentina in the right direction and helping to fix rampant inequality?
I don't think that I am in a position to pass judgment on a particular leader at the time. I can tell you from as an Argentine and as a journalist that these issues are structural, just like they are here in the US. This is not something of this government or the past 10 years. This is something that has happened for the past 100 years, which is concentration of wealth, which is tax avoidance, including through tax havens. And also, unfortunately, in my country is corruption. There's a culture of corruption that is very systemic. And so, and because there is corruption, some people think that they are excused or justified in not paying taxes because they're going to steal it anyway. And that is such a terrible cycle, right? It's a cycle that leaves our democracy and our institutions very weak. And it doesn't have to do with the current government. It has to do with our history. It has to do with our political class.
And then, so he kind of had some follow-up questions. And he said, do you think that protests in neighboring Chile would spark unrest in Argentina? And then he also said, do you think Alberto Fernandez will tackle corruption?
So I actually am very impressed with the protests in Chile. Chile was one of those. Chile is an unsettled narrative right now. Chile was the country that even I have been guilty of this, of saying, is our model country. Like, I wish we were all like Chile. You know, Chile was like kind of like a model of stability and economic progress and so many things. But, you know, I grew up right close to Chile and I went on vacation there and I saw a different Chile and a Chile where inequality was even worse than in Argentina, where university was completely out of the reach to a huge part of the country. So that couldn't, and of course then to that you add, you know, many years of dictatorship. So there was something, so yes, there was a phase, there was an apparent phase of stability and progress, but under it, there were a lot of things that were not right. And I think that these protests for the past now year and a half have been showing that people are not going to take it anymore. They're not going to accept that kind of inequality and disparity.
And then, so Kaylee has a question. Have you ever reported a story that was dangerous for you to find information on?
For me too?
The question was, have you ever reported a story that was dangerous for you to find information on?
I personally have been in situations where it was dangerous to find information. I have been in situations where it has been physically dangerous. I reported about illegal trades in the tri-border area of Latin America, where Paraguay, Brazil, and Argentina meet. It's a high crime area. And I was there on the ground reporting about the illegal trade in drugs and cigarettes, and there were some very intense scenes that took place on the ground trying to report that story. But I always say that I have, because I've lived in relatively stable countries like Argentina or the United States, I have been pretty safe, all things considered. But my colleagues, that I've always been working collaboratively and in networks, and my colleagues are the ones that often have had the most difficult situations to face. The Panama Papers, the Paradise Papers, all these investigations put a lot of journalists on the ground at great risk. They experience a lot of harassment, intimidation of all kinds, from online harassment that was led by like prime ministers and presidents of countries. They, in places like Honduras, or Ecuador. They were the ones instigating this kind of attacks on the press and on the journalists reporting on the Panama Papers. To other journalists in Africa that had government officials knocking on their doors or sending messages through intermediaries. To our colleague Daphne Caruana Galicia in Malta, you maybe have heard of her. She joined the Panama Papers in a second wave of reporting, and she was killed. A bomb was placed in her car. It wasn't just for the Panama Papers, but for all her her reporting through many, many years, basically being like a very lonely voice in journalism in Malta, challenging narratives and exposing corruption. So this is investigative reporting is it can be lonely and it can be dangerous, and that's why collaboration and working in teams with colleagues around the world is the best way to overcome that isolation, to protect yourself, and to help protect your colleagues if you happen to be the one who is in a country, in a less dangerous environment, in a less dangerous country. And then the last thing I would say, what we all face, regardless of where we are the legal threats. There's a whole industry about suing journalists. And that's why it's so important that our reporting be rigorous and documented and fair. So we are not opening ourselves to those lawsuits that can be incredibly, not only distracting, but disruptive, and can basically get our organizations out of business, as it has happened. Entire media outlets have folded under the weight of these lawsuits that any of these powerful people can just file out of fun. They have fun with it. It's nothing, it's pennies to them, but it can be the fate of our organizations for us. Sorry for the long answer.
And then so let me find it. Evan and Angelica kind of both have the same question, but so the question is there a story besides the lead poisoning one where you feel you made a significant positive difference in people's everyday lives?
I'm trying to think I think that I actually want to think that some of the stories that our colleagues and that I was part of, on the tax haven work that took like 10 or 12 years of sustained reporting made a difference on everyday people's lives. Just made their experience a little bit more just by seeing that they were actually seeing that somebody powerful was losing power because like that injustice that seems so difficult to change was actually changing. That by going, to the public square and demanding change, they were actually seeing tangible change. That money was going now to be invested in schools or transportation or healthcare system that would have never gone if journalists hadn't exposed these black holes of finance. So it's hard to equate your to draw straight lines between what you report and the direct experience of someone. I once reported about an immigrant family who was going to be deported, and the story was powerful, and it showed how much of a community leader this family was. And the story was entered into the court case, and I was told that it was it had weight. It was considered by the judge they call witnesses based on that story. And that family was not deported and continues in the US. They are all American citizens now, and they're thriving. So maybe I helped a little bit in that.
And then, so we have one last question just from Lucas. What do you think about many governments crack down on encrypted private data? Will this become worse globally in coming years?
Yes, unfortunately, like the US government has for years now been working really hard through the NSA to disrupt encryption, to create backdoors to encryption. So this is the reality that we live in. Having said that, I would say it's still really hard even for the NSA to break encryption. And so if you are going to communicate with sources, if you are needing to protect sensitive information or sources, do encrypt your messages, use Signal and use encrypted email for all communications, because failing to do that may leave a lot of your colleagues and your sources unprotected.
And then, so we actually have time for one more question. This is going to be from Angelica. Do you have a particular story that is your favorite or stands out that you have reported?
I think that the ones that I have shared today are some of my favorite stories.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Marina, for doing this Q&A with me. And thank you so much, everyone else.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the questions and your attention on this Saturday morning, afternoon.
Thank you so much.
And everyone for asking. Sorry, let me go ahead really quick. Thank you everyone for asking questions. I'm sorry if we weren't able to get to all of them. I know there were a couple others, but I'm gonna turn it over to Fareed now, so that way we can end on the time that we said we would end, okay?
Well, you saw in the chat, shout out to you, Xavier, and I hope you got your questions answered. If not, hopefully just anybody who didn't get your questions answered, we're sharing the chat with Marina as well. So we can see if we can get those responses to you. So with our last few minutes, I thought we could hold space for a 1-minute challenge while we have an executive editor with us today, and then close with a quick survey and a review of what's happening next week. So the challenge is this: for 1 minute, remembering Marina's tips to look at what feels unfair or wrong, to think about what might be legal but immoral, and to think about who. Well, I don't want to misrepresent. Can you repeat the third point, Marina?
The third point is like whose voices are not being heard.
Yes. 1 minute to just fill the chat with any story ideas you have right now based on those 3 questions. What do you see in your communities or in the world that feels unfair or wrong, that maybe is legal but feels immoral to you? Or who are you not hearing from that you think should be better represented in the media? So I'm going to put 1 minute on the clock for us to just kind of brainstorm in the chat, and then maybe we can get Marina's feedback on some of her ideas. And this is a safe space, right, Marina? We're no judgment on the ideas.
All ideas are good. The COVID pandemic is underserved. Russian provinces such as absolutely. So yes, especially, and the COVID pandemic is like certain the root causes, right? Like not so much like who's, not the statistics or which countries are leading the infections, but what happens, deep, at a deeper level. Certain regions of the world are undercovered. Catalonia independent crisis, that's a good one. The Navajo Nation struggles with COVID-19, that's what I was meaning with the root causes. The LGBTQ panic defense laws in the US. Redlining in US cities. I feel we need to hear more from our Native community on a variety of topics that their voices have gone unheard. Absolutely, I agree 100% with that as one of the most affected communities. gun control laws are overreaching on United States constitutional rights. Absolutely. And, you know, gun control is one of those narratives in this country that is so hard. It's going to take decades of sustained reporting and work to even be able to have a conversation about that topic. But it's possible. We have seen this today, 2 systems that have been changed, that have been challenged. So the food insecurity of the Navajo Nation, detention centers, the whole issue of incarceration in America is just incredible. And right now at the Pulitzer Center, we are looking at detention centers from the point of view of the elderly. An amazing percentage of those incarcerated are over like 60, 70 years old. They are under great threat from the COVID-19 and they cannot get out. And also the experience of women, incarcerated women.
I'm going to jump in real quick just for time's sake. Thank you, Marina. How'd we do in 1 minute?
That's incredible, amazing.
Please pursue these ideas. And next week, what we're going to be talking about is how you could potentially use photography as one of the communication methods for communicating your reporting. So just to close, I'm going to put this link in the chat to a quick survey. And I think Takara is going to share this with you as well. It's going to ask you for who is the journalist you met with. So this is the name if you just want to copy it. But again, we'll also reshare this survey with you. And we use these surveys to improve these presentations and to gather some feedback for our guests. I also wanted to quickly share with you the this is the bio for our guests next week. We've just gotten confirmation today that an incredible photojournalist, Anita Puchard-Serra, who has a lot of experience with not only reporting herself, but also teaching and talking about how you can apply photojournalism skills. She's going to join us, and we've come up with a really fun workshop. So you might want to have a device with you that you can use for taking photos. If you don't, it's fine. But that will be our plan for next week. So we've got the survey. We know what we're doing next week, same time, same place. I thought we could just close before I turn it over to Takara with, just like last week, sharing in the chat, what is a word or phrase that captures something that's sticking with you from today's presentation? We'll just hold 30 seconds for us to think about what those are and write them into the chat, starting now, 30.
Very interesting. You guys did really good picking up on some of these words. Good.
5 more seconds. All right, please continue to add if you're still thinking of yours, but I thought one way for us to just sort of end together before I turn it over to Takara to close us out officially is on the count of 3 to just, you know, prep yourselves right now, just like last week, unmute yourself. And for those of us who can, and we're just gonna say our words on 3. All right, you ready? 1, 2, 3.
Legal but immoral.
Action. Excellent. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Marina. And I'll turn it back over to you, Takara. Thank you, Xavier.
Thank you. Thank you. A huge thank you to both Marina. Thank you so much. Your presentation was very fascinating and it was great to introduce students to these topics. Fareed, thank you for all of your work helping us organize these sessions. And Xavier, you did awesome. Really, really good job. Thank you so much.